Hi, it's Miss Lisa from the St. Paris Public Library. Welcome back to Just Before Bed, our chapter book reading for the summer reading program. Tonight, we're going to start a new book called Guardians of Ga'Hoole, The Rise of a Legend. The author of this book is Kathryn Lasky. It's a bit of a different kind of read for us. It's a fantasy book about owls and different kinds of owls and how they are living and stuff. So it's going to be a different kind of a book. It's a little bit more for older kids, but younger kids might enjoy it too. But it does have a little bit of graphic conversation in it about blood and eating animals and things like that. So if you have sensitive children, you may not want to go through this one. But we're going to start tonight in the prologue of The Guardians of Ga'Hoole, The Rise of a Legend. Prologue. Tonight, something odd happened. A young barn owl and 3 of his companions showed up here, blown right out of the Force Eagle 8 gale. A raging thing it was, that gale, full of slop and ice. Couldn't see for raindrops out there. These 4 had been traveling together for some time. They called themselves the band, or a band, as if they're special or something. Perhaps they are. It's the barn owl, the one called Soren, who interests me. There's something about him that took me back to my own youth. It stirred me deeply. So I decided to put aside this book I've been working on, the 3rd volume in weather systems and their structure, how to fly them, analyze them, and survive them, and turn instead to something a little less academic, a little less dry. Indeed, a story drenched with blood from endless wars and also tears, both happy and sad, of love, betrayal, and of hope. The barn owl's just a lad and does not know what he's in for. I certainly didn't. Oh my, I was such an innocent, if one can call. The Book of Ezylryb, The Owlet Moons, Chapter 1, I Hatch Out. The first crack in the egg that held me occurred just before midnight. My mom and Da weren't there, of course, as the action in the century-long war of the Ice Claws had heated up and they were both away fighting. So they'd gotten a higher broody for the egg, common practice in war-torn northern kingdoms. When my first crack started, the higher broody, Gundifer, sent out Mrs. Grinkle, our nest-made snake, to inform the neighbors. Hatchings were treasured occasions, particularly during times of war, for every new chick was viewed as a potential fighter. Most likely, everyone bent over my shell, urging me to soldier on in my first battle, getting out of this egg that had sheltered me for nearly 2 moons. Come on, chickie, follow in the flight marks of your Da, the old general. And his mom, don't forget his mom, the commando. The words were muffled through the shell, and I really didn't understand much, but I would soon learn that my mom was a commando in the Ice Dagger unit, and Da was supreme commander of all the allied forces of the Kielian League, which included the famous Frostbeaks as well as the Hot Blades and other divisions. In short, they didn't come home too much. Don't feel sorry for me. This was the way it was back in those days on Stormfast Island in the western part of the Everwinter Sea. It would have been mighty queer for an owlet to have both parents around, almost embarrassing, quite frankly. I soldiered on in the shell, knocking my brains out trying to get out of there, although most of the work was done by my egg-tooth, peck, peck, ram. Then pry a bit, rest, then peck some more. Soon I had opened another crack. There was a great hooray, and then a gasp. Someone had just arrived. What's she doing here? A voice said in stunned disbelief. It was, I am told, my Tatya Hanja. The good cheer and boisterous spirits receded immediately. Tatya Hanja was my mum's sister, so Tatya must mean aunt. Hanja, Aunt Hanja. The 2 of them were as different as sisters could be. Tatya Hanja wasn't a military type, Glocks, no. She would have been disastrous in battle. Instead, she was a quiet little thing whose whiskers seemed longer than her wings. She had a funny style of flying, a permanent list to port, which disqualified her for military service. To compensate, her starboard wing had grown much larger than the other, and she seemed a bit lopsided, but she got around. Everyone called her Prinka Hanja. Prinka meant poor in Krakish, the language of the northern kingdoms. They felt sorry for her because she couldn't hunt as well as others. Therefore, she led an itinerant life visiting relatives. Our family dreaded it when she showed up. She had a knack for appearing when something bad was going to happen. So when she arrived the very night I was hatching out my broody, Gundafur began to tremble fiercely and crouch over my egg protectively. Oh, good Glocks, Gundafur nearly keeled over as Tatya Hanja approached the nest with me in it. Would love to have a peek. I had a haggish time getting here, Tatya Hanja said. The winds were against me the whole way. I see I have arrived just in time. First crack already. Second crack, actually, Gundafur said weakly. Can I tidy up here a bit in preparation for the new chick? Would you like me to gather some moss? It's always comfy, isn't it, for the little ones, as they're almost bald after they hatch out. And here, Gundafur, let me give you some down. Hadja poked her beak into the thick feathers of her primaries and plucked out the downy ones beneath. Oh, that's really isn't necessary, Gundafur shrieked. Don't shriek, dearie. Not just before the second crack. That could jingle things up the wrong way for the exit crack. Now, we wouldn't want that, would we? Gundafur exchanged a horrified glance with Elfstrom, a neighboring Snowy, who had entered the hollow and clamped his beak shut at the sight of Hanja. Elfstrom had seen more battles in his lifetime than my two parents put together. He was on leave from a striker unit after a fierce battle in the Ice Narrows. Very little unnerved this veteran commander, but the sight of Tatya Hanja did. There you go, Tatya Hanja said, tucking some of her down into the brooding nest. Now, I'll be back in 2 shakes of my tail feathers with some moss for the little one. Bet he'll be handsome like his big brother, Edvard. Such a handsome screech, that one. Just as she was about to leave, she turned and said, Nearly forgot. Might as well take some of my whiskers. They grow so long this time of year that my talons get tangled in them. Gundafur didn't need to worry. There were no odd jingles to interfere with the exit crack. I hatched out just fine. Of course, my eyes were still sealed shut. I could see nothing, but I could hear voices muttering about Tatya Hanja. I couldn't make that much sense out of it. It just came to me in fragments. Why did she have to show up? Always an ill omen. But look, he's fine. Who was she? Who was just fine? He's just fine. Was that a very long name? And then suddenly the words stopped and there was terrible sobbing sounds. No words, just long, agonizing cries interrupted by short, wet blubberings and gasps. Someone called Edvard was dead. What was an Edvard? What was dead? I would very soon learn that Edvard had been my brother, and a messenger had arrived from the Hot Blades unit saying that he'd been killed in action over the Firth of Fangs. So as I entered the world, more or less staggering from my shell, I was surrounded by crying adults, Gundafur, Elfstrom, the Snowy, a neighboring barred owl couple from across the way, as well as 3 or 4 Kielian nest-made snakes. Oh dear, sobbed Mrs. Grinkle, a very elderly nest-made snake. I guess you're the man of the nest now, she said, looking at me. Me, who still had the goo of egg yolk on my unsightly, featherless body. Everybody began sobbing anew. I had no idea what she was talking about. I started pecking at the slime left in the fractured cup of the egg. This is an owlet's first meal, and as such provides the occasion for a ceremony. First slime, it's called. But in the tumultuous grief of the moment, everyone seemed to have forgotten this except for Tatya Hanja, who had returned with soft moss for the nest. Calmly she began to sing. Lick the slime, there is time, dear owlet. You have hatched, now you feed, as is decreed. May you grow big and strong, fledge your wings, learn to sing. but this is your first feed. So to you we say, Glock speed. Hanja continued, now we must all pull ourselves together because I think this is a precious little chick here. I have a feeling he's bound for greatness. Oh dear, Mrs. Grinkle, the nest-maid snake whispered. What she feels is greatness is sometimes tragedy, the tragedy of heroism like dear Edward. 2 days later, Hanja left, and there was a great sigh of relief at the end of Stormfast Island. And before I knew it, it was time for my first insect ceremony. But even more memorable would be my first meat ceremony, for my mum and da had returned by then. Chapter 2. Fuzzball to Fledgling. The owlet years can be divided into 3 stages. The first is commonly called the fuzzball stage. The subsequent ones are the fledgling and the flight stages. They are often referred to as the 3 Fs. The fuzzball period is named after an owlet's lack of true feathers. Instead, we are covered in unsightly patches of downy fluff. All adult owls think we are extremely cute, absolutely adorable. How quickly they forget. If you are an owl chick, you're embarrassed about being half naked, and because you're half naked, you're always cold and dependent on mature owls to cuddle and comfort you to keep you warm. Worst of all, you can't fly. You examine yourself every 5 seconds for any trace of budging points, those tiny little knobs of flesh where feathers begin to poke through. In the fledgling stage, a chick begins to learn how to branch. Of course, in the northern kingdoms, there aren't many trees, so branching purrs is difficult. Instead, we have to use rocky, often ice-sheathed outcroppings. My family was lucky, for we lived in one of the few stands of trees in Stormfast Island. The hollow in which I hatched was in a slender pine. But I digress. It was long before I branched that I had my first meat ceremony, and this was when I met my parents for the first time. They're coming, Gundifer hooted. Who's coming? I chirped. Your mom, your da, back from the last battle near the Ice Talons, and just in time for your first meat ceremony. I get to eat meat? I did a little jump. Meat was actually more exciting to me than my mum and da. Remember, I had never seen a mum or da. But I'd seen a lot of meat. Gundifer and her friends were always chomping on rock monks, a kind of chipmunk that lived in the rocky cliffs on the Stormfast, or lemmings or voles. Sometimes they even ate fish. The fish owls dove for them off one point of the island, but all I ever got to eat during my fuzzball stage, beyond the slime from my eggshell, were carefully selected insects. Insects don't have meat, and most significantly, they don't have blood. The scent of blood from when Gundifer and her friends came in with freshly slaughtered rodents was enough to drive me yoinkers. So I was beside myself when I heard that my parents were coming and bringing me a plump vole. The only problem was that when Mum and Da flew into the hollow, I nearly yarped. It wasn't the vole with its steaming guts slithering out from the slash of my mum's talons that made me want to yarp. It was Mum who gave me a fright. She only had one eye. Where the other eye should have been was a pit leaking blood through a seam that had been coarsely stitched across it. Do all mums have just one eye, I wondered? I couldn't help myself. I shrieked when she bent over me. Suddenly I knew this was the face of war. Oh dear, my patch must have slipped off, my mum said. She quickly reached up with her port talon and pulled down a small piece of lemming fur to cover the eye pit. I didn't mean to scare you, Lyze. No, never. You are a dear little thing. Gundifer nudged me a bit. She then whispered, Greet your mum, dear. Oh, let him get used to me. I know it must be hard. I'm just glad I've got one eye left to see him with. Hello, Mum. Sorry, I was trembling. I just couldn't look at her. Never mind, dear. You'll get used to it. But would I? And what if I didn't? Everyone was a warrior, a soldier. All anyone ever talked about was war. This was our life. Why, owlets often knew their higher broody and the nestmade snakes better than their own mums and das. I knew I would have to toughen up, so I dared myself to look at the horrible gash that ran out from under the lemming fur like a jagged thunderbolt down her face. Did I doubt war at this point? I'm not sure. After all, I was just an owlet, but I might have doubted myself and whether I could be an honorable member of the Kielian League. Rask was my father's name. It was an old soldier name and meant fast or quick, but he was not quick enough apparently. One side of his face had been seared and he was missing his whiskers. Not a great sight, but not nearly as shocking somehow as my mum's missing eye. What a tough little owl we got here, a veritable whisker spritz, my father said. Whisker spritz was a term of endearment for a young whiskered screech owl. It meant full of spirit. I felt anything but, and truthfully, I felt a bit cheated. My parents were legends on Stormfast, but heroes or not, one was missing an eye and the other half his whiskers. And then I realized that it was shameful for the son of heroes to be thinking this way. Don't let this bother you, son. My da tapped his whiskerless side of his face. Do you think they'll grow back? I asked. Probably no more chance than your mum here has of growing another eye, but we showed 'em, didn't we, Ulfa? He turned and nuzzled my mum. Where was the battle, sir? Gundifer asked quietly. Nay, not just quietly, but reverently. She looked straight into their mangled faces as if paying homage to their scars. I must try and do the same, I thought. First Ice Talon, between there and the ice narrows, just a skirmish really. They got her eye and my whiskers, but we got them. By Glocks, we got 'em. We were the only ones in our units who were injured. Very lucky we were, very lucky. Lucky, I thought. They call this luck? All I could think about was my mum's eye, somewhere at the bottom of Everwinter Sea. However, when they started to speak of the strategy and the weapons, I must admit it interested me. War seemed like a strange but violent puzzle to me. We left our mark, didn't we, sweet Giz? My da nuzzled my mum's chest feathers. Darn hootin'. Your dog raked off half a great horn's beak, and I snapped off not one but two of the other fellow's talons. Mercy, exclaimed Gundifer, and you having just lost your eye? I know, not sure how I did it. It's one of those instances in battle when you don't think, you just do. Something rushed through me like a hurricane-force wind and just propelled me. I didn't feel any pain, any anger even, just a passion to destroy. It's called being a soldier, my da said. You'll do it too someday. Someday, young'un. He turned to me, almost jubilantly, as if anticipating the courage I wasn't sure I'd have. I wonder if I would ever be a soldier, a true soldier. When can I have my meat? I'm hungry, I said. That's the spirit, lad, my father boomed. Yes, let's get on with the first meat ceremony, my mum's voice rang out joyfully. Before I knew it, the hollow was crowded. For this ceremony, my mother stripped the fur from the vole, and then my father stripped the meat from the bone. It was more digestible this way for a young chick. We were not expected to swallow the creature whole. Like the grown-ups do, our gizzards aren't up to it. Mum and Da were around for a good while, as they had been granted a long leave, and before I knew it, I had passed through my first fur-on-meat ceremony, which meant I got to eat the entire vole, skin off the bone, but with the fur. The fur tickled when it went down. And finally, it was time for my first meat-on-bone ceremony. For that, they always bring back quite a small rodent, either a baby or one of the dwarf rats that scrambles about on the beaches of Stormfast. There's a bit of a knack to eating a creature whole. No, dear, head first. They slide down the gullet easier that way, my mother counseled. Once I got the creature oriented right, I believe it was a dwarf rat, I took it down with one gulp, followed by a very loud belch. You sound like your old man, lad. My da laughed and gave a loud belch himself. Honestly, Rask, Mum sighed. And then, of course, it was time to sing the belching song that celebrates the first time an owlet eats his first whole animal with meat, fur, and bones. The song is called the owlet, a word that looks almost unpronounceable here on the page and resembles the sound of a deep belch that can only be made by animals with gizzards. Owls essentially have two stomachs. The first is a stomach like most animals have. The second is the gizzard, a thick-walled and very muscular stomach made for grinding up grit and packing in small bones and fur. Owlet is the sound made when something passes from the first stomach to the second one, the gizzard. Gundifer started the singing. Owlet, owlet, let the sound ring out. There's a little critter that no longer scampers about. Lodged in the gizzard, fast and cozy it does lay, and soon a pellet is on its way. And very soon it was. Mum and Da led me to the edge of the hollow, and I yarped my first real pellet. I was growing up fast. Chapter 3. First Feathers. It was a fine pellet, exquisite, Mum said. Manly, said my father. Then they had a nice little spat where Mum said that there was no such thing as a manly pellet any more than there could be a feminine or girlish pellet. But to me, the most thrilling thing of all was standing on the rim of the hollow and looking outside for the first time. I felt the cold air, the flurry of snow in my face. I saw the slender limbs of the pine tree in which we lived and the beautiful green needles poking through the snow-laden branches. And in a neighboring tree, I saw an owlet teetering on a branch. What's he doing, Da? Learning to branch. I want to do that. You will. No, I mean right now. You haven't fledged yet, silly, my mother said. You have to have at least a few feathers before you can branch. Now come inside, you're shivering. No, I'm not. You're cold, dear, Gundifer said. I am not cold, I said, but in truth, the skin between my ugly patches had turned almost blue. What a beauty I was. From that moment, I was on high alert for any signs of budging. Every day when my parents weren't looking, I would creep to the edge of the hollow and watch the owlet across the way. His name was Moss, and I was insanely jealous. He was a snowy and had hatched out the very same night I had. Perhaps he beat me out of the shell by an hour or two, but no more. I would say he was a big owlet, but he was not unusually large for a snowy. It was just that snowies are naturally much larger birds than whiskered screeches. And that hour or so seemed to have given him a feathers up. Yes, he was fledging out fast. When I asked why Moss had fledged so quickly, all the grown-ups around me replied, well, snowies just do that. It was one of those irritating answers that adults give and expect young'uns to take on faith. Well, not me. I take very few things on faith. Not then, not now. To my grim little eyes, Moss swathed in these gorgeous, fluffy white feathers with several dark splotches, seemed huge, and he was branching beautifully, budging, branching, flying. These were all called flight marks in an owlet's progress towards wing mastery. I knew it was only a matter of a few nights until Moss would be actually flying, and I would be stuck in this Furchtooken hollow. Unfortunately, I had the stupidity to blurt out the word Furchtooken one evening when I was complaining about not being a fledgling, and I earned myself a firm swat on my tail fluff from Mum. Furchtooken is a curse word. I didn't know this at the time, but when I stood on the rim of the hollow and observed the world outside, I heard a lot of things from warriors on leave, a lot of swear words. I had even heard my father say Furchtooken when he was talking with an old Kielian League buddy about the action on the front. Then there was a terrifying story I heard one evening when my parents thought I was sound asleep. They spoke in low, hushed voices, and maybe it was the very softness of their voices that alerted me. Did you hear? My mom asked. Hear what, Ulfa? Dad's voice was tense. The news from over in the Bay of Fangs, a snowy family. My mum did not wait for Da to answer. It was as if she had to get her story out. They say it was in a pine grove, maybe just like ours. Quiet, you know. Her voice dropped lower, and I had to strain to hear. He comes up with 2 of his lieutenants, and there were these snowies. She seemed to gulp. Well, their young'un had just hatched out, and maybe the night before, and he was trying to recruit them for the Ice Talons League. I guess they refused, and he went mad. Yoikers, completely berserk, then seized the young'un, stuffed him in a bodkin, and screamed, "I'll make a soldier out of your babe, if not you." He killed the parents in front of the owlet's very eyes. He did that, Rask, and it isn't just a rumor, it's the truth. I felt my own gizzard freeze when I heard this. I knew already who he was. Bylyric, the commander of the Ice Talons League. They said he was not simply ruthless, but completely mad. There were many names for him, the tyrant of the Ice Talons, and then the orphan maker. I wrapped my wings around myself and tried to go to sleep. I wanted to be a soldier like my mom and da, but their conversation had shaken me. Bylyric was evil. Every owlet knew that from the time he or she hatched out. Bylyric was the reason that the war was fought. But Bylyric was not that old. He had not always been around, and it seemed as if my parents could barely remember why the war had begun more than 100 years ago. If Bylyric was killed, would the war keep going? Had something been set in motion a long, long time ago, and no one knew how to stop it? But before I could draw any conclusions, I suddenly had an itchy feeling in my starboard wing. I ran my tongue, yes, owls do have tongues, over the itch, and by Glocks, there was a tiny bump. It can't be, I thought. It can't be, but it was. I'm budging, I screeched. Mum came running over. Really? She exclaimed with delight. Let me see, Lyze. Don't call me Lyze. I'm about to fledge. When can I go to Darkfowl? When? The flight to Darkfowl Island marked the end of the owlet moons. It was when an owl proved his or her wings and could start to train to become a cadet. This island to the southeast of Stormfast in the Everwinter Sea was practically all one ever heard about on Stormfast for many reasons. First, Darkfowl Island was where some of the best weapons in all of the northern kingdoms were forged. Orf, rogue, Smith presided over the forge that had come down to him through his forebears, a long line of great greys with an uncanny ability to understand not just metal, but ice as well. He was as much a hero as any soldier. It was just going to kill me if Moss got to go to Darkfowl before I did. By this time, Moss had fledged out gorgeously and was now doing an admirable job of branching and bragging. Every time I looked out from the hollow, he was carrying on about how by the next wanking of the moon, when it was thin as the finest filament of down, he would be winging his way to Darkfowl. I couldn't stand to watch his progress, and yet I could not tear myself away. I hopped over to the hollow's entrance just in time to see Moss's father toss a dead vole to the ground. Moss went into a plunge called a kill spiral. It was a game known as lob and gob. Owlets who had just learned to branch played it all the time, as it was the best preparation for hunting. As soon as a fledgling owl learned to fly, he or she would hunt for food. I had only played lob and gob in the hollow with Mum and Da, or sometimes our new nestmate snake, Gilda. They would fling about a dead mouse, and I would try to loft myself into the dim, hollow air, get as far as I could, and then pounce on it. Talon placement is very important. One needs to grasp the creature immediately, secure, talon lock, and then puncture its lungs or heart. Watch this, Moss hooted across from the tree where he lived. This is going to be great, Da. But it really wasn't his father he was addressing, for he always looked my way. Then he would do something rather spectacular for a branching owl, and his father would flap his own huge white wings in approval. Moss's wings were not pure white, not yet. Immature snowies have a dappling of black feathers mixed in with the white ones. They are actually quite striking, especially in comparison to a screech like myself. When I finally fledged completely, I would be a rather drab plumage, grayish brown, brownish-ish. That's me, not quite one thing or another. One might even say we whiskered screech owls are rather dingy looking. The one feature that redeems us from this drabness is, ironically, our call. I say ironically because, after all, we are named screech owls, but our calls can be the most mellifluous sounds you have ever heard. Some say our voices are like starlight, or like the sound of the stars singing. Some have compared the lower register of our hoots to the sound of the wooded flute, like those found in the ruins of the others' castles and palaces. The word others is capitalized in here, so I think that means humans. The ruins of the humans' castles and palaces. Our calls are nothing like the harsh, gruff barkings of a snowy owl, of which I have been hearing quite enough, thank you very much. But at last came the fateful night that was to mark the beginning of a most unlikely friendship. It was the night that Moss flew for the first time. I took my first tiny little jump from the branch just outside the hollow to another that was no distance at all away. To me, this jump was a triumph, but the hoots that clawed the air to herald a great feat were not for me, but for Moss. Moss had completed his first circumnavigation of Hawk Point at the far end of the island. I was furious that Moss's flight eclipsed my little jump. To fly to the Hawk, rest, and then come back was one thing, but to fly around the tip of the point and all the way back was extraordinary for an owlet. Moss might as well have flown to the moon. Can't be long now, son. Next stop, Dark Fowl, his father boomed. Ever see anything like it? And Uncle came up and thwacked Moss with his port wing. I blinked. If anyone had thwacked me like that, I would have fallen off my branch. My mother alighted on the branch next to me. You did an admirable job, Lyze. Very graceful. I shrank down at her words. She was so obviously trying to boost my spirit in the shadow of Moss's spectacular achievement. What are you wilfing about, dear? You just branched, for Glock's sake. She nodded her head vigorously, as if to drive this idea home. Her bandana slipped a bit, exposing the eyeless, crinkled pit. Mum, I whispered, your bandana. She flicked me a rather harsh look from her good eye and adjusted the bandana. I felt terrible for even mentioning it. Meanwhile, in the next tree over, Moss was absolutely wallowing in the accolades his relatives were showering upon him. There was much talk about how it was such a shame his mum could not be there to witness his great achievement. Repeatedly, he lifted off a branch to demonstrate how, when she finally arrived, he would show her a certain maneuver he had made. Then, when Kittibit's winds were swirling about the tip of the Hawk, the Kittibits often picked up bits of debris, seaweed, and even the odd tiny flying fish or minnow. Moss was now brandishing a small bunch of sea grapes that had a dead minnow entwined in them. Would you look at this, he exclaimed, and a minnow. Eat it, his older sister cried out in an awful grating hoot. It's good luck. Old wives' tale, someone barked. Old wives? Speaking of old wives, it was Moss's father, his beak dropping. Glocks, is it really? Rena, my dear Rena. Just then a Snowy landed, shouting, Moss, Moss, my dear son. All I remember from that moment is that Moss suddenly seemed to wilf. All the bluster went out of him, and oddly enough, he cast a glance towards me, a sly, almost frightened glance. Moss and his immediate family disappeared into the hollow, but outside the celebration continued. It would be a few nights until I saw Moss again. Chapter 4, Moss and Me. My father suggested that we accept the invitation to visit Moss's hollow, since his mum had returned now. All returning warriors like to exchange news from the front. Mum asked me if I wanted to join them. Is Moss going to be there? I asked. I really didn't relish watching him brag about all his accomplishments. Well, yes, of course, dear. Isn't it high time he flew off to dark fowl? I mean, he did all the steps, proved himself, I said rather dismissively, perhaps without gravitas, the dignity required when speaking of such things. My mother cocked her head and made no attempt to adjust the bandana that had slipped with this sudden motion. Lyze, I'm not sure what your problem is here, but I don't like your attitude. We're invited over, and you are coming. Fledgling jealousy is an unbecoming trait, she paused. Some say it can even make your barbels grow crisscross. That, I was sure, was an old wives' tale. On every flight feather, there are tiny, nearly invisible hooks called barbels that interlock to produce an even surface over which wind can glide. A favorite scolding for young owlets was, "Don't do that, or your barbels will come out whiffy skew." Mum squared her shoulders and gave me a harsh glare with her one eye. "You shall be coming with us. You shall congratulate Moss on his magnificent flight, and you shall behave yourself in a manner that becomes the son of the supreme commander of all the allied forces of the Kielian League and the commando of the Ice Dagger unit. Is this understood?" I lifted my starboard talon and gave what I hoped was a crisp salute, even though I was shaking terribly. Neither my mother nor my father had ever spoken to me this way. I felt a terrible crinkle in my gizzard, and I tried to avoid my mother's gaze, but she thrust herself towards me and shoved her face so close to mine that her feathers swept my cheek. She cocked her head so that terrible scar pit where her eye had been filled my vision. It looked like a burnt crater. "Take a good look, my dear. You want a perfect mother, do you? One that is not scarred. You know what did that? I remained silent. She took a deep breath. "You know what took my eye?" "No, Mom." "An ice splinter. An inferior one at that. I flew right into it. Never saw it coming. Had I not been flying at fever speed, the damage wouldn't have been so bad, but it was. And now you have a flawed, imperfect mother." "Flawed in body," my father added, "but not in spirit, not in valor. Is being a soldier the only way one can fight?" I asked. My parents blinked at me. Their large yellow eyes seemed to dull with incomprehension. I might as well have been speaking a foreign language. "What in the name of Glocks are you talking about, son?" Da asked. Nothing. Forget it." "Yes," Mom nodded emphatically. "Forget it." I looked down at the bark worm that was creeping across the hollow floor. I felt lower than that creeping, spineless, soft-bodied piece of squish that the nest-made snakes feasted on. My mother spotted it as well. "Where is that new nest-made snake? What's her name?" "Gilda?" I ventured. "Yes, that's the one. She's not as good as Mrs. Grinkle. I can't wait until Mrs. Grinkle gets back from visiting her relatives." "Gilda!" she called out. "Yes, ma'am, yes." Gilda slithered in and gave a salute much crisper than mine, which, considering she was a snake, was rather impressive. "Sorry, just out. Another snowy from the tree across just took flight and is headed towards the point. Guess young Moss has set a new standard." Would this never stop? Everyone except yours truly here seemed to be progressing in the speediest manner. Fever speed towards true flight and dark fowl island. And now, most frustrating of all, we were off to visit Moss's Hollow. The new local hero in flight accomplishments. I would probably make a mess of even this brief flight, which, truth be told, wasn't more than extended branching. Mom and Da went out on a brief hunting foray. They said it was gracious when visiting neighbors to bring a rodent. I could hear Gilda swishing as she slithered about, swiping up vermin with her forked tongue and neatening the hollow. I watched as Mum and Da lofted themselves onto a gust. Wings spread, they carved tight, elegant turns until they were over the crowns of the trees that made up our small grove. They angled their wings so the tips seemed to brush the sky. I envy them, even if I could only fly so beautifully. So do I, a voice behind me spoke softly. Gilda? I wheeled about, nearly losing my balance on the rim of the hollow. I thought the words were in my head, but I must have whispered them aloud. Yes, your parents are beautiful flyers. It stirs me deeply. I blinked. Gilda had twisted herself into a neat coil and had been peering over my shoulder out into the night, tracking my parents' flight. But how can you envy them? You're a snake. I know, odd, isn't it? But I can just imagine what it might feel like to fly. You can? Yes, she answered with a wistfulness to her voice as she gazed out the hollow. I looked at her as she slithered off. Something struck me about this snake. Mrs. Grinkle was nice, but Gilda was much more interesting. I was drawn to her from the time she first arrived for some reason. I think it was her stories. She told the best twixt-time stories as the dawn came and I was supposed to be settling down to sleep. But now I knew what it really was that captivated me. It was her imagination. Any snake who could imagine flying had to be special in some way. That's probably why Gilda wasn't a very good nestmaid. She thought deeply and didn't pay attention to barkworms and wood beetles and such. I followed Gilda back into the deepest part of the hollow, where she was wrestling with a small nest of threadworms. What you want, dearie? She turned around. I just blurted it out. I'm scared that I'll make a mess of landing on that branch outside of Moss's Hollow, and everyone will laugh at me. Everyone flies so much better than I do. Oh, nonsense, Lyze. You'll do just fine. No, I won't. You won't if you say you won't. You must believe you will, lad. But how can I believe I will if I am not sure? Yes, not sure. How do you believe if you're not sure? Now that is a good question. Some creatures say faith is believing what you cannot see or prove, but I believe that faith is the power to imagine. If you can imagine the feel of the air beneath your wings, if you can picture in your mind's eye your plummels brushing the sounds from the night and quieting your passage, then you will fly as well as any owl. Gilda was right, so right. My goodness, Mum gasped as I landed on the branch. I've never seen anything like it, my father said, his voice tinged with awe. You flew as if every single one of your plummels had budged, and they haven't yet, have they? They're always the last to come. No, I don't think they have, I replied. Then how did you do it? You were so quiet, Mum asked. Oh, I just imagined the plummels. Imagined? Both my parents said the word at once, as if they had never heard it before. Moss's Hollow was at least twice as large as ours. This was to be expected, I suppose, seeing as Snowies were more than twice the size of whiskered Screeches. From their heads to their tails, they measured the length of 3 Screeches end to end. But one thing I remember best is how wilfed Moss was. He was all scrunched up at his mum's legs like a chick trying to get warm under her belly feathers. This was Moss? The gifted, talented Moss? I was astounded, but I had forgotten how I had seen him wilf the day his mum first arrived. Now he seemed not just puny, but frightened and scared. Yes, frightened. The mighty Moss, who just a few nights before had returned from his triumphant circumnavigation of the Hawk. What was wrong with him? He seemed to be cowering. And every time his mum moved, so did he. It was as if he couldn't be an inch from her. Was Moss a mama's owlet? The visit started out with the requisite small talk. Profuse thanks for the 2 voles my parents had brought. More talk about Moss's amazing circumnavigation. But then, as always, the conversation turned to the war. Yes, Harena had a time of it up around Little Hole. They have a few small stealth units wreaking havoc up there. They hide out in the fissures. Snow leopard terrain, my father said. I was immediately alert. Snow leopards had fascinated me, and Gilda had once told me a twixt-time story about them. They could not be found as far south as Stormfast and lived in the high mountains ranges above Rathgar Glacier, fierce with fangs nearly as long and sharp as scimitars, and exceedingly swift they were, my father said, built to kill. There was a pause in the conversation as Helena and Arn, her mate, exchanged glances. Arn gave her a barely perceptible nod, and I noticed Moss begin to quiver. Yes, built to kill, Arn said. Then Helena spoke in a raspy whisper, and so am I. She lifted her port leg. The foot was blackened and the 4 talons fused together into one mangled lump. I must have looked shocked, for she turned to me and then to Moss. Don't fret, she said cheerfully. You're never really tested until you're in the field of battle, and you young'uns will both make wonderful soldiers. I know it. Don't you, Rask? Don't you, Ulfa? I had to fight hard not to wilf in front of everyone's eyes. I noticed that Moss didn't look too chipper either, which made me feel a tad better. It wasn't the snow leopards that got me, though. It was 2 eagle owls. They thought they had me when they came at me with a fizz blister. The grown-ups kept talking, but Moss was wilfing so fiercely I thought he might simply vanish. Now I understood. He was overwhelmed with shame. Yes, shame at the hideous deformity of his mum's talons and how they looked as if they had melted in the fires of Hagsmire. The grown-ups were consumed with talk of war, and and not paying a bit attention to us. This foot has become a weapon in its own right. I swear it's as powerful as one of those gigantic snow leopard paws. The force I can deliver with it is amazing. After I healed and was battle ready again, I managed to crack one of the enemy eagle owl's starboard wings nearly in 2 in an ambush half a moon later. She raised the foot with the fused blackened talons. It looked like a club. An eagle owl, I heard my parents exclaim. An eagle owl had a wingspan at least half again as big as a snowy's. She chuckled a bit. Now I lead a commando unit called the Flying Leopards. Did it with this. It's better than an ice axe. You might say this wound has made me built to kill. Helena shook the mangled talon. Moss had clamped his eyes shut. It was clear that he was a bundle of fear and shame. I lofted myself into the dim light of the hollow and flew toward my mum. What is it? She asked. I gave a small tug on her bandana. Oh my, you want me to show off my battle scar, do you? She chuckled, obviously pleased. It's not a competition, you know, dear. Helena and I both did our bit. That's all a soldier can do. No, it wasn't a competition, but how could I explain that to Mom? I just wanted Moss to see that I knew what he had been feeling. Moss sidled up to me and whispered, I saw you arrive tonight. It was a beautiful landing, better than any I've ever made. How soon do you think you might be ready for Darkfowl? I'm not sure. Why? Because I'd like to fly there with you. It would be much more fun if we could go together. So it was on that night, in the hollow of the Snowies, while our mums and das spoke of war and bloody battles, that Moss and I became best friends. Chapter 5. A Snake Named Hoke. Shortly after our visit with Moss's family, I attained that most significant flight mark for an owlet before going to Darkfowl. I made my own trip to the Hawk. Da was there to coach me, but I already had a feel for the breezes and knew when to sheer off a boisterous draft. That evening, I soared for the first time. I seemed to have an instinct for the warm thermal updrafts, and what a thrill those silken billows of warm air were to ride. I didn't even have to flap my wings once, and yet I slid effortlessly through the starry night. As I soared, I could not help but think of Gilda. Her words about faith came back to me, about believing in what you cannot see. Yes, I was flying, but I was experiencing something more than that on this beautiful night. Another kind of faith began to seep into my mind, and as I flipped my head back to look at the star-dusted sky, I thought I could almost see the face of Glox. Hawk ho! My da's call split the night, and then I saw it, the steep cliff that climbed out of the sea. What's that? I called back. What's what? Just off the cliff, the the night was laced with iridescent threads of turquoise and greenish light. Oh, yes, of course. Always a surprise the first time you see them, diving snakes. Great glocks! Snakes can fly? I thought of Gilda immediately. Oh, no, never. They can swim, though, and they dive into the sea from their caves. My beak dropped open in amazement. I could never have imagined anything like this. But, how do they get back up the cliff again? They crawl up, same way they slither up our trees in the grove. But where do they live? In the cliffs. They find nooks and crannies, and they burrow out others. Let me tell you, there is nothing stronger than a Kielian snake, and you'll see that when you go to the Darkfowl, their fangs. They use them to hone the edges of the ice scimitars. But Gilda and Mrs. Grinkle, they're Kielian snakes. Never seen their fangs. Well, they keep them tucked away. Not much use for them in domestic service, really. Can we visit the hawk snakes? I want to meet some. Whatever for, lad? Daw looked absolutely dumbfounded. My facial feathers must have wilted with disappointment because he continued, Well, I suppose it would be all right, but you know, they aren't all that sociable. They don't like company. Will they bite me? Oh, no, they're not aggressive. They just like to keep them to themselves, especially the ones on hawk. There's a reason why they seek out the most forsaken place on Stormfast. They like the isolation. He stammered. I don't think I have ever heard my Daw stammer, but he seemed totally bewildered by me. He collected himself and started up again. Say again why you want to meet them. I'm just interested, that's all. Another species, you know. Just curious. How does one explain curiosity? What if I just sort of went up and said, hello? I suppose so. The worst that could happen is that they wouldn't say hello back, my Daw said doubtfully. That was all I had to hear. I was determined to meet a Kielian snake, and not one who worked as a nestmaid for my family. So, like Moss, we began a circumnavigation of the hawk. I didn't just go around it, but soared its entire vertical surface looking for a friendly face. There were indeed many faces. Hundreds of them rose from the tumultuous sea and began their long, slow slithering up the sheer cliff to the top, where they could dive off again. The moon had begun to set, and their iridescent scales sparkled even more brightly in the darkening sky. I tried saying hello and good evening to dozens of snakes while they whizzed by me on the plunge towards the sea. I said, Guten Hagen, or just a quick Hagen, or sometimes Hagen Hordo. Hordo was the Crackish word for snake. I assumed they spoke Crackish, the language of the northern kingdoms, and not some kind of snake language. Gilda and Mrs. Grinkle spoke Crackish fluently. Surely these snakes did, even if they were unsociable. I began working the midsection of the cliffs more diligently, as there were a few crannies in which I could see the twinkling glimmers of scales. Hagenhordo, I said to a snake who poked his head out. The snake whipped his head around. Evening, snake? He replied, incredulous. I know I'm a snake. I don't need to be confirmed by you. I don't say, good evening, bird. Well, I'm not just a bird, I'm an owl. A whiskered screech, to be precise. And I'm not just a snake, but a Kielian snake, a spotted azurback, to be precise. What's azure? What's azure? Are you serious? You don't know what azure is? If I were a snake, maybe I would. If you were a snake, he sneered. His eyes seemed not to blink exactly, but slide with a glittering flash and then simply vanish. I would later learn that snakes do not have 3 eyelids as owls do, upper, lower, and then a wiper membrane, but only one, if indeed you could call it an eyelid at all. Their eyelids are composed of transparent scales that close either vertically or horizontally. There was a second flash and the snake's eyes were back. The snake seemed to have gone through an odd transformation, almost a molting, not of his skin, but of his attitude. I shall attempt to be patient. The sneer was gone. It was not as if the snake had become all warm and fuzzy. It's very hard to be warm and fuzzy if one is an elongated, legless creature with scales. Hoke's the name, the snake said. I thought this place was called Hawk, I asked. Me, idiot, the eyes flashed again. My name is Hoke, Hoke of Hawk. The sneer had returned. His voice seemed to curdle with contempt. I was catching on. I could play his game too. Ah, I see. You're telling me you're an idiot, I parried. His mouth cracked open and he flung back his head, exposing the longest, sharpest fangs one might ever imagine, and croaked. Not hissed, mind you, but croaked. This was how Kielian snakes laughed. But did I know he was laughing? I did not. I was scared out of my gizzard, began to back out of the cranny, nearly falling off the ledge before I could spread my wings. Come back, he hissed. I like you. You made me laugh. Let me just say this. When a Kielian snake laughs, it can scare you to death. But I returned, for despite the laugh, there was a kindness in Hoke's voice. Come in, make yourself at home, he said with real warmth. My nost. He swung his head around. The nost was what Kielian snakes called their hollows, and this nost was much larger than I had anticipated. Do you live here by yourself? No, my parents are off visiting relatives. My sisters and brothers are around someplace, probably still diving. I looked about. I didn't realize these cliff nosts were so large. They aren't. We made them that way. We dig and tunnel with our fangs and heads. I've never understood that. I tried to picture Mrs. Grinkle digging through what appeared to be solid rock. No, you wouldn't, he said with a slight sneer, but I decided to let it pass. Why not? Well, you've probably only been exposed to nest-made snakes. True. And nest-made snakes really only need their tongues for vermin slurping and their heads for whisking up dust and twigs and all matters of debris that litter owl hollows. Tidy butts, we call them. But you're snakes. You don't have butts. No kidding. A smirk scrolled across his face. Sometimes we borrow a little bit of language from other species, particularly body part words. Try being legless, wingless, long, and tubular. We are not spineless, however. What a relief. But even so, you dig through rock. How? To answer my question, the snake called Hoke began the most astounding sequence of shape-shifting acts imaginable. Well, he said, as his head flattened into a thick wedge with a new set of scales beginning to fringe the edges. You've seen this, of course, in your nestmaids, the basic whisking or broom phase for cleaning owl hollows. In truth, I had never really paid attention when Mrs. Grinkle or Gilda swept up. But they did have a secondary set of scales that seemed to gather around their necks, if indeed those long wingless bodies had necks. But have you seen this? Hoke's head swelled into a large, bulbous configuration, great for smashing lithite. That's the kind of rock these cliffs are made of. Let me demonstrate. There was a small chunk of rock nearby. Watch this. Please note, I do a semi-coil as it gives me the right amount of heft for this size rock. A 1, and a 2, and a 3. Within seconds, the rock had been reduced to smithereens, and a small dusting of scales drifted down among the chips. Not to worry. The scales regenerate quickly. The rock doesn't, however. Something slithered in the rear of the nost. There was a yawn, and a childlike voice called, Why did you wake me up? Helly, that you? Yeah, who else? You're supposed to be snake-sitting me, remember? And instead, you're just showing off. A tiny little snake wiggled towards the shattered rock. Great hordax, you're talking to an owl. Helly was almost the same color as Hoke, but somewhat paler. Is she also a spotted azurback? I asked. Of course I am. I'm his sister. She opened her mouth quite wide to announce this, and despite her small size, she had formidable fangs. You're showing off, Hoke said. She just dropped her baby fangs last night. These new ones came in today. I am not, she replied huffily. Just answer me one thing, I said. You never explained what azure is. It's a word I've never heard. It's a color, Helly squawked. Be patient, Helly. He's only an owl. Duh, she muttered. Only, I thought, but let it pass. Hoke swung his head toward me. Azure is a shade of blue. It is closer to the color of the sky on a clear, cloudless day. But then there is cyan and cerulean, very close to azure, and then cerulean lazuli, and then turquoise and cobalt and violucia. And then the violucians, you have both your straighted and your non-straighted. The straighted tend more towards the deep purple. The non-straighted are more or less lavender. You see, there are over 1,000 shades of blue for Kielian snakes. Our scales are actually a spectrum of all of these shades, but some of us are more azure, while some tip towards purple, the purple end of the spectrum. I am almost dizzy from the recitation of the blue spectrum of Kielian snake colors. Did you show him your slim head? Do it, Helly urged. It was apparent that she was much more interested in her brother's ability to reconfigure his head shape than in a discussion of colors. Would you like to try it, Helly? Hoke said gently. Oh, I can't do it like you can. Try, he turned to me. Helly is just developing her head-shaping muscles. The more she practices, the better she'll get. All right, I'll try, but don't expect too much. Remember, concentrate, Hoke urged. Helly uncoiled her entire body and made herself as flat as possible on the floor of the Nost. She grew very still. I'm concentrating, she whispered. Her eyes seemed to cross with the effort. I noticed a quiver in her head. It was flattening slowly into a spade shape. Good, good, you've got the shape. But I can't get it thin enough, she cried in exasperation. Her body suddenly contracted and she recoiled herself. It's not a shim. It's a big, fat, old, lumpy thing, she whined. You had the shape, Helly. You really did, Hoke said. You show him how it's supposed to be done. Within seconds, Hoke was stretched out to his full length, and his head was as thin as a wet leaf and very rigid. He slithered over to 2 rocks that were stacked atop each other in a notch in the wall and began prying at the bottom one. With a shim-shaped head, it's amazing what you can do. What's amazing, Helly whispered, clearly entranced by her brother's abilities, is that he can do this while he's talking and not lose his head shape. Within seconds, the bottom rock was free. With Helly's encouragement, Hoke went on to demonstrate another half a dozen head shapes he had mastered. The sledgehammer, the anvil, the axe, and so on. I heard a flapping of wings outside the Nost. Lyze, Lyze, you in there? Oh, yes, sorry. Lyze, Hoke said. Is that your name? Yes, I'm sorry I never properly introduced myself. My father stuck his head inside. He blinked with surprise. Meet my friend Hoke and his sister and his little sister Helly. Well, I'll be, Da said.